Stan as well. I've been Stan's for 50 years. So.
The kids are obviously excited about that. Okay. I will probably, once we get started, I'll probably shut the lights off. It's a bit easier to see on our screens once we get going, just in case you see it gets dark. But I'm going to show you to the students here. They all want to say hi, so everyone say hi.
Hi, guys. Greetings from Boston.
Okay, I think you guys all set? Ready to go? All right.
All right. Well, greetings from Boston and Earthwatch. I'm Dr. Stan Rullman. I'm the research director here at Earthwatch. And I am really thankful. You guys sent me some wonderful questions. And it was really fun for me to go through all of your questions and try to create a presentation that includes a lot of the answers to your wonderful questions. But I want to start with a question back at you. So I might need you. I don't know if you're muted right now.
Nope.
Oh, okay. So I have a question. This is my favorite punctuation is the question mark because it's pretty much what science is based on, being able to ask a question and then especially turning that around and being able to answer that question. So here's my question for you guys. Because I was asked this question. Well, I'm always asked this question. Sometimes my dad still asks me this question, and I guarantee you've been asked this question before. What do you want to be when you grow up? Raise your hands.
Okay, Kendall, you want to go?
Have you thought about it? Yeah?
Where to go?
Make sure that your face is in that.
Yeah? Answer. Tell your name.
I'm Kendall Hines. When I grow up, I want to be a professional football player.
All right, all right.
Okay, Cindy, you're up here.
I'm Sydney, and I want to be an interior designer.
Cool, cool. I might hire you for my house.
I'm Corey Kopetsky, and I want to be a dentist, but in my free time be an author too.
Oh, that's a good combination. I like people who come up with these ideas to combine different careers in different ways. Let's have two more.
Okay, I'm Ian McVicker, and I would like to be an app designer or a photographer.
Oh, cool. And you can be both of those as well.
Claire, come on up.
Actually, at Earthwatch, we're working with some app designers right now for some data collection apps for the citizen science stuff that we do.
Hi, my name is Claire Tanner, and I want to be a nurse.
Cool, cool. Well, one of the cool things that I learned about sixth graders is that for most of you in that room, the job that many of you will have for much of your lives hasn't been invented yet. We're living in changing times, and there's a lot of new types of positions and careers and jobs that are coming out every single day. And so for many of you, the job, when I ask that question of what you want to be, what do you want to do when you grow up, for many of you that job has yet to be invented, and it might be you who comes up with a brand new career type and invent your own job. And in some ways, I've kind of done that. I've combined a couple different things. Now, when I was in second grade, my second grade teacher, Mrs. Vokes, asked my class that question. And it was 1971. So I lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. We had a little baseball team called the Cincinnati Reds. Have you ever heard of them? You guys are kind of up there closer to Chicago, so you may end up getting more Chicago fans up there. But I grew up closer to Cincinnati, and so I was a Reds fan. So guess what was on my list of what I wanted to be? Baseball player was on my list. In 1971, when I was asked this question, we had just put people on the surface of the moon for the very first time in human history. What was on my list? Astronaut was on my list. Cowboy? Still on my list. But when Mrs. Vokes asked my class that question, I had a different answer. And I'm going to switch now to my presentation because this is the original. This will go in the Stan Rullman Museum someday. That probably isn't going to happen, but my mom saved this. So I'd like to use this to introduce myself to both students and teachers because this is something that shows that I have almost always been on this path, this wild path that I'm on as a wildlife biologist. So I'm going to switch to the presentation. Can you see that?
No. There we go.
There we go. Took a second for it to catch up. So this is the answer to that question that I wrote in 1971. You can see up in the upper right-hand corner, it says December 13th, or 12/13/71. It says, I'd like to be a biologist because I like to study life. I like to cut off bark of trees with my pocket knife. I like to study plants and things. I like to study animals, especially raccoons, foxes, and all living things. Well, if I really studied all living things, I'd be a very busy person these days because we now know there are nearly 2 million different types of plants and animals and all kinds of other living things that call this planet home. And we're going to talk a little bit more about 2 major ecosystems that are home to more species of plants and animals than anywhere else in the world. But before I get there, I want to talk a little bit about the career that I've had and the path that led me here to be the research director at Earthwatch. So this is the essay that I wrote. This is the crayon drawing that goes along with every second grade essay. And this is like a roadmap of my life. It shows a groundhog down in the corner near where I grew up in Ohio. We had groundhogs. A skunk over in the other corner. Robin's nest up in the treetop. Blackbirds flying overhead. Lions and apes right over that stick figure in the middle that says me, because for the first 3 years of my life, I lived right across the street from the Cincinnati Zoo. And so the sounds of lions roaring and gibbons calling and elephants trumpeting and peacocks going, ah! All those sounds were part of my childhood coming in through my window. And there were probably a lot of smells coming in through that window as well. Many years later, I went to work at the Cincinnati Zoo, and I was the conservation coordinator there for 12 years. I started out as a cat trainer in the Cat Ambassador program. This is me working with, at the time, the world's only leash-trained snow leopard named Tundra. Tundra and I worked together for a couple years. I also worked with some tigers. I've raised 14 tigers from cubs, all of them leash trained. And I ended up meeting somebody very special there too. This is my wife. My wife is the one on the right, and her name's Jennifer. And she's working with one of our native big cats, a native North American mountain lion, after we upgraded our stage area. So I had an opportunity at the zoo to work with a lot of different wildlife, some of my all-time favorite animals. This is a peregrine falcon that was part of the peregrine falcons being released into the cities of the Midwest, including Indianapolis. I also had a chance to travel the world. I started leading trips for the zoo's travel program, and this was a trip in northern Thailand where they've been working with elephants as beasts of burden for several thousand years. We have a very long history of working with these animals, and they're used in forestry. They were used as transportation, kind of like here. They were even used in warfare of different groups riding elephants into battles. And I also had a chance to see these animals that I was so passionate about working with at the zoo back out in the wild when I would lead some of these trips. So here's some of the big cats from leading a trip to Botswana and Tanzania, those areas. In addition to taking pictures, though, I started listening, and I became very interested in the sounds of these landscapes around the world. The sounds that I would hear in Peru were very different than the sounds that I would hear in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was growing up. And I started recording these sounds, and in some cases, working these sounds back into zoo exhibits. Some of our rainforest exhibits have sounds that I collected from these areas around the world. This picture is me recording in the Central African country of Gabon on the Atlantic coast, recording the sounds of a forest that had western lowland gorillas that we were supporting field conservation projects there, and then also playing the sounds of this landscape in the zoo exhibit that featured our western lowland gorillas. At the bottom of the screen is a website, naturesoundmap.com. Ms. Kapler, feel free after we do this sometime to go there, and it's a big world map of projects that people have recorded the sounds of nature all over the world. It's pretty cool.
Some of the students have already listened to things that you have posted.
No way!
Yep, they have.
That's cool. Thank you for listening. In 1998, I had an opportunity that presented itself that I couldn't say no to. I had an opportunity to leave my work at the zoo and go work with a little lady who's been studying chimpanzees for longer than I've been alive in western Tanzania. This is a photograph of some of the animals that I grew up hearing about. Actually, the mom, Rullman, is one of the chimpanzees that Dr. Jane Goodall had studied. I had an opportunity to spend some time and live working with Jane, with my wife Jennifer, in the field there on the east side of Tanzania, but going into the field and taking teachers and students out to Gombe National Park looking at chimpanzees in the wild there. And then we also worked on a book together to really promote the Roots and Shoots project in Tanzania. Are you familiar with the Roots and Shoots program? Ms. Kapler, have you heard of that?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, take a look. It might be a fun thing to get some students involved with. You can have a student group that gets involved in doing all kinds of conservation stuff. In fact, I'm just thinking of this kind of on the fly, but it would be a great way, you'll see when I come around at the end of this talk, to tie in getting your hands dirty, getting out in the field and doing some stuff. So your question to me that I was originally presented for this project that you're working on is, what impacts the world? Well, I took that literally. I thought about it, and I went back to one of the first things that impacted the world was, well, not one of the first, but I think it's happened several times. But to tie it into what we're focusing on today, about 65 million years ago, an asteroid hit the planet and led to the extinction of many, many animals that are no longer around today. The dinosaurs, in pretty much one fell swoop, were eliminated from the planet about 65 million years ago from this major impact with an asteroid. I bring that up because extinctions happen. They've been happening on this planet for millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years, probably billions of years. Extinctions have happened. And this circle in the little red circle there is that last major one where an asteroid hit the planet and took out the dinosaurs and many other organisms. But it's happened about 4 other times in the history of this planet where there have been major mass extinctions. And there's some concern going on right now that we might be in the middle or at the beginning of something that they're calling the 6th extinction. Elizabeth Colbert just came out with this book called The 6th Extinction, which is a look at this concept. And at the Cincinnati Zoo, we actually paid pretty close attention to extinction patterns. In the background is a list of all the species that are considered threatened or endangered today. But at the Cincinnati Zoo, and you may have heard this if you've studied anything about zoo history or wildlife history, in 1914, so 100 years ago, this year, a species that at one time was the most abundant bird on the planet became extinct. This is the passenger pigeon. 4 years later, also at the Cincinnati Zoo, one of our native parrot species, the Carolina parakeet, also became extinct. And so the zoo has an exhibit, a building that is called the Passenger Pigeon Memorial. And I bring that up because, not because I don't want to lay this downer on everybody that, yes, things become extinct and we're going through potentially this next extinction spasm. I don't like to teach that way. I bring it up because it's part of my history in being a part of, at the Cincinnati Zoo, a group of people who swore not to let that happen again. And there's a lot of really interesting news, a lot of good news that I'll come around to toward the end, and also a lot of interesting things going on with extinct species right now. 2 weeks ago, there was an article, or I guess this was several weeks earlier, this was back in November, where an extinct frog from Australia, using some of the tissue that was preserved from this frog, they were able to create living cells of a species that had gone extinct. There's a lot of people trying to figure out if they can do that with other animals as well. And because of the range where mammoths and mastodons lived, they are finding a lot of frozen tissue, perfectly preserved frozen tissue of species that have been extinct for 12 to 15,000 years, including mammoths and mastodons. And there's some people who think that they might be able to bring back those species. Just last week, there was an article, I think in the New York Times, that brought up the fact that bringing extinct animals back to life is really happening. And it's going to be very, very cool, unless it ends up being very, very bad. Where are these animals going to live? And if the ecosystems are not available to them, why are we going through this effort? It reminds me of another scenario that happened a couple years ago. This is a scene from a movie where the guy says, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should. Does that sound familiar? Anybody see Jurassic Park in the last, I don't know, decade or so? So that was one of the lines from Jurassic Park talking kind of about that same thing. So what do you guys think? Should we try to bring back extinct species? Yeah, it's not... I think I've heard the full range of answers there. There aren't any really easy answers. But this is something, and I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move through these, but maybe Ms. Kapler can ask these questions again, and you guys can provide some really good discussion about whether you think it's a good idea to do this. I heard answers, both yes and no, and then a lot of things probably in between. But there's a lot of big questions with this. How should we decide which species to try? How far back do we go? Do we go those that have only gone extinct in the last couple years, so conditions might still be very close to what they existed in? Do we go all the way back to things like the mastodon and mammoths that were around but haven't been around for 10 to 15,000 years? Do we go back beyond that? I don't know. And then I already asked this question. So, in 1994, I'm switching gears now a little bit. In 1994, a sixth grade student friend of mine, Caitlin Maynard, her dad, Thane Maynard, who was my boss at the Cincinnati Zoo, and I all took a group of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students down to the country of Belize. And it was about a 3-week trip in which we spent a lot of time exploring, looking for wildlife, both in the water and on land. We spent a lot of time reflecting on the things that we had seen, because for all the students, this was the first time that they had been into this landscape that they had grown up hearing about. Caitlin kept really good notes. She was really good at journaling. And so every day you would see her working on writing down her thoughts and her feelings and the lists of birds that we saw or the snakes that we almost caught or the things that we would see snorkeling. And from that journal, we created this book called Rainforests and Reefs, A Kid's Eye View of the Tropics. Caitlin was the lead author on that. She as I said, she did a great job writing when we were down there, and we turned mainly her journal with some extra information added in by my friend Thane and I into this book called Rainforests and Reefs. And Ms. Kapler, if you check your mail next week, there'll be a copy of the book in your mailbox at your school. I'm sorry I didn't get it there in advance. It would have been fun to have it in the classroom, but it's on its way. The book is out of print. We did it back. It was the trip was in 1994, and then it took about a year to put the book together, and the book came out I think in 1996. And so anyway, there's a copy of that book coming to you. But for me, it was an opportunity for me to teach a group of junior high students about something I was very passionate about, and that is the tropical rainforests of the world. You guys are lucky in so many ways. You've grown up reading about, hearing about, watching documentaries on Animal Planet and the Discovery Channel and National Geographic Channel, and hopefully you're watching some of those nature things on the screens that you're watching. We know a lot about this ecosystem. There's so much information out there. We have these great first expectations of what these landscapes are going to be like, but when you get there, your first impression is, wow, this place is green. Rarely do you see the jaguar leaping onto the back of the tapir while a flock of scarlet macaws fly overhead, being chased by a harpy eagle that's already clutching a monkey in its talons as the anaconda wraps around the capybara. You don't really see that what the nature documentaries show. Unless you're there for a while, and the longer you're able to spend time exploring these landscapes, the more things you're going to see. So the rainforests, the tropical rainforests of the world, are located primarily between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, or that belt that we call the tropics around the world. And they're found throughout Central and Northern South America, Equatorial Africa, and then Southeast Asia, India, Southeast Asia, Polynesia, and then around the islands that are kind of on the fringe of this. So this is one map. Here's another map that shows a very different distribution of these tropical forests. I'm going to go back. Just pick a place like, do you guys know where Madagascar is?
Yeah.
Okay, half of you look at Madagascar and half of you look at India. So here's one view, and here's the other. And these maps were done at about the same time. What I'm showing here, and as you're starting to look, when you're working on a report, for instance, on, say, the rainforest, there's some actual different definitions of what a rainforest habitat is, what a tropical rainforest habitat is. And so in some cases, these tropical and subtropical forests have different categories, and so the numbers shift a little bit depending on what type of tropical forest you're focusing on. There's some tropical dry forests that the trees lose their leaves just as most of the trees do around Plymouth, Indiana, or Boston, Massachusetts do. There's cloud forests, a type of rainforest that are usually higher up in elevation, and so the clouds rise up and condense on the vegetation and it drips down to give them the moisture they need. There's tropical monsoon forests. There's tropical deciduous broadleaf and evergreen broadleaf. There's all these different categories. But if we kind of give them that generic label, tropical rainforests, and add them all together, they make up only about 6% of the total land area of planet Earth. And yet, in that 6%, they're home to over half of all species of life forms on the planet. And actually, the more that we learn about tropical rainforests, the more undiscovered species we find, the more we realize that they're probably closer to about 90, maybe even 95% of all species of life forms call the tropical rainforest home around the world. So we refer to the diversity of species, diversity of life as biodiversity. And this map shows a different thing. This shows with the dark red color, that is showing where the most species of life forms live. So from this map, where do you think most species, what continent, let's say continent, what continent do you think most species of plants and animals have been documented in? South America. Good job. But definitely, if we look all the way across the world, we're seeing that the highest biological diversity or the highest biodiversity is in the tropics, along that midsection of the world. One of the reasons why tropical rainforests are so incredibly diverse is that they have these multiple layers of life. And what we're going to do quickly to go through we're going to explore some species that are found in these different layers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about each one because I want to work through this so that we can have a little bit more banter and discussion. But we're going to basically pretend like we're climbing up one of the vines that may be hanging down from the canopy of the rainforest. And it's also important to note that these same types of layers of life exist in many of our own forests. And in fact, this time of year, what you'll be noticing soon, if you haven't already started to see it, is the greening up of that lower layer. So very often, this forest floor and shrub layer in our forests in the Midwest begins to green up first. And then the understory, the shrubs and that tend to start leafing out. And then the canopy, the trees overhead, begin to send their leaves out a little bit after that. And so we have a similar structure in many of our forests. If you go out in the forests around Plymouth, you'll see some of this stuff happening over the next month or so as it's starting to green up as we work our way into spring. On the forest floor is the best place to find some of the venomous snakes that live in the rainforest. This is a close-up shot of a fer de lance, one of the poisonous snakes that is found throughout Central and Northern South America. And I'll add that I took almost all of these pictures. This picture was taken down on the island of Trinidad off the coast of Venezuela. This one looks like a dinosaur. This is a male basilisk lizard in Costa Rica. Basilisks, even though this one's in a tree, they usually don't go very high up in the tree. They live on or in trees and on the ground next to different waterways. And so this is one of the species of lizards you may know. Does anybody know what's special about the basilisk lizard? What it can do?
They can walk on water.
They can walk on water. Good job. A male this size probably has a hard time doing that. But I've seen young ones and females drop out of a branch like this into the water. And as soon as they hit the water, they take off. They lift their front limbs up and take off running across the water. And it looks like they're running across the surface of the water. It's so cool. I don't think this guy would be able to do that, though. Poison dart frogs are also found on this forest floor layer. This is one of the larger species. This one is found down in, I believe, the western Amazon basin in Peru. Females are usually larger than the males, and both male and female do something pretty cool because they are, even though they're a pretty small frog, they will climb all the way up from the forest floor into the canopy of the rainforest. Many of them lay their eggs in some of the bromeliads, or these plants that grow on the trees way up in the canopy of the forest. So some of these species, you might find them on the ground one day, and the next day you may find them way up in the canopy. I think if any animal is a visual ambassador of the tropical rainforest, at least the tropical rainforest over here in the Western Hemisphere and Central and South America, it might be the red-eyed tree frog. I've seen they're found just about anything that talks about rainforest ecology will have this, we could call it a flagship species for the rainforest. And they too live down closer to the ground and in the shrub layers. These usually don't go too high up into the canopy. Birds are found throughout all layers as well. Some species of tropical birds are very poor flyers. They can't fly much farther than from one branch to another. Others are wonderful migrators. And in fact, some of the birds that live in the rainforests right now are preparing for a big journey coming back up to Indiana, to your neck of the woods. We think of them as our birds that come back, that migrate south for the winter and come back home. But for many of these birds, home is actually the tropical rainforest. And so they migrate down to home each winter or each fall and return to these landscapes up north where we live to raise their families. But home is kind of an interesting concept to these birds, but for many of them, home is actually the rainforest. They spend more time in the rainforest there, and many of their relatives, the species that they're related to, spend all their time there. So this is down in Peru on the Tambopata River. This is a scarlet macaw up in a treetop area. In this area, the macaws come flying into these giant cliffs of clay. And because the macaws eat a lot of plants and seeds and nuts and fruits, many of these actually have poisons in them. And so the macaws fly into this clay and chew on it, eat it, and it helps neutralize the toxins in the foods that they eat. Without a doubt, the most represented group of organisms in the rainforests are the insects. Many of the insects are brightly colored to maybe warn that they're poisonous. Some of them are brightly colored so they mimic those that are poisonous, but they're not. And then you have katydids like this one. This is one of the leaf mimic katydids that has this wonderful camouflage. All they need to do to hide is to be very still, and they blend in looking just like a leaf. Many of the animals that live up in the canopy of the rainforest are small because it's hard, it's easier for these small animals to move around. But some of them can be quite large, and in fact one of the largest apes in the world, both the Sumatran orangutan and the Bornean orangutan, often go all the way up into the canopy to look for ripe fruit to forage. Their upper body strength is phenomenal. They can, if they were able to bench press, it'd be hard to convince them that that was something that they want to do. But if you were to put them, they could probably bench press better than any professional football lineman. They're just so incredibly strong because that's how they move through the forest canopies. And we're able to get up to these landscapes as well. This is a place called the Amazon Center for Environmental Education and Research along the Napo River, major tributary to the Amazon River in Peru. And they have a canopy walkway that covers about 13 acres of land. So it's a big area. A lot of trees are connected, and it's a great place to go explore this landscape that usually we can only see from down below looking up with binoculars. And if for those of you that were listening to some of the sounds that I've recorded, one of the sequences was recorded in that little structure there. I was with a group of students just a couple years ago in 2008. We took a group of students down. I'll talk a little bit about them because it was a very special group. And we focused, this entire trip was focused around the sounds of the Amazon. And so we did a recording right there on that tree platform that was, I think we recorded about 3 hours of audio. And then I have posted at one of those sites about an hour of that. So these canopy walkways allow us, that we're so good at spending time on the ground, but it gives us an opportunity to get up into the canopy and explore these areas. So I've done some bird research in the rainforest and have done sound recording in different parts of the world in the rainforest. And I mentioned in 2008, I took a group of students. I was on the board of directors of a student travel organization called Global Explorers. And we started working with students with disabilities. And so I led a group of blind students to the Amazon in 2008. We had visually impaired and blind students, including my friend Jonathan here, who's demonstrating reading a National Geographic magazine in Braille to some of the local guides. They'd never seen anybody be able to read with just their fingertips. But the focus of that trip was a sound recording trip. And so we recorded the sounds of the forest, probably the riskiest thing I've ever done in my life. One of them is recording the sounds of blowgun darts hitting a wooden target. And the students that are blowing with the blowguns were blind. So, they weren't poisonous darts, and I had a long boom pole so I could get the recording device a bit farther away so I didn't have to be right there. But I ended up getting some wonderful sounds of blowgun darts shooting through the air and more often than not missing the target, but some of them hitting the target. Any talk of rainforest ecology, tropical forests, you have to go to the space where we talk about the fact that many of these forests are disappearing. When I first started hearing about rainforests, the percent of the land cover of the planet that was considered rainforest was closer to 10%. Now it's less than 6%. And these photos, if you look at the piles of logs, these are from 3 different parts of the world, 3 different trips. The bottom left one is from the country of Gabon, where a lot of the marine-grade plywood comes from the akume tree. The bottom right is on the Amazon River from just a couple years ago, and the upper right is on the island of Borneo, the Kinabatangan River. All of these cases, one of the reasons why the forests are being, the land is being lost, the forests are being taken out, the trees are being taken out, is for this valuable resource. Now, trees grow back, and in most parts of the world, this type of harvest wouldn't be that impactful. But in the rainforest, in many parts of the world, the soil underneath the forest is so thin that if it rains for just a couple months after the trees are taken out, it can wash away the remaining soil, and then it's really hard to grow anything back in that place. So very often, if trees are taken out, something is planted very quickly. And in the upper left-hand corner, what's planted here is oil palms. This is also in Borneo, and this is what much of Borneo looks like. There's a lot of palm oil plantations being put in after the forests are taken out. Now, what do we use this palm oil for? Well, palm oil appears in so many different foods. Some of our favorite foods, chocolate bars, cookies, energy bars, frozen pizzas, waffles, pancakes, granola, ice cream. And this is just the stuff that we eat. The palm oil is in also a lot of the stuff that we use. It's in a lot of our soaps. It's in our detergents. It's in our shampoos and conditioners and makeups and that. So this palm oil, there's a market. There's a demand. The world is wanting a lot more of this stuff. And it's being provided and growing in these landscapes that used to be amazing tropical forests. And even as we're trying to shift away from petroleum and oil, there is a demand for this palm oil as a biofuel. So even reducing one potential impact on the planet by trying to reduce our dependence on oil, we're changing the landscape to grow some of these biofuels. So I'm going to direct you to another website when you get a chance. This one just was released a couple weeks ago. It's called Global Forest Watch. This is the homepage that you land on when you get there. And then you click in the middle, and then you can zoom in kind of like Google Earth or some of those mapping programs, you can zoom in, you can zoom all the way into, say, Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife area up in your neck of the woods, and you can see patterns of forest recovery and patterns of forest loss. So this is what it looks like if you zoom into northern Borneo. In this case, all the pink represents forests that have been lost in the last 10 years. All the blue is forests that have regrown. So these are places where they have gone in and either intentionally planted a lot of native trees to grow back in these areas, or the trees have come back after they've been clear-cut on their own. But in most cases, what is pink here today, if you were to go on the ground, it would be a palm plantation. Now I want to switch gears, because this is about rainforests and reefs. And it's fun to lump them together as we did in the Rainforest and Reefs book, because the coral reefs of the world are the hot spots of marine biodiversity. And so the reddish dots on this particular map show the more tropical warm water coral reefs of the world. But there's also coral reefs that grow in cold water. I just moved to Boston from Seattle, and within about 3 football fields of my house was a park that had tide pools, and there was a type of soft coral that grew in those tide pools. Those tide pools are usually about 54 degrees year-round. They're very cold water, and yet some corals grow in such cold water. And so this shows kind of the distribution of those coral reefs around the world. Coral reefs are hot spots, as I said, for marine biodiversity. More species of marine organisms, both fish, marine invertebrates like the corals themselves, sea anemones, sea stars, sea urchins. A lot of those species reach their highest diversity areas in the tropical coral reefs. What do coral reefs have? Well, a lot of these species that are being discovered every year, they're discovering new species. They're also discovering that many of these species we might be able to use medicines from, or extract different things and create medicines that are helping people. The same is true in the tropical forests. A lot of the plants that have developed these resistances to bacteria lead to wonderful antibiotics that we're able to create. And so a lot of these are also coming from the coral reef systems. There's also a lot of economic reasons to preserve coral reef systems around the world, because people depend on these coral reefs. For many of them, it's their sole source of food, is the fish and invertebrates that are harvested from the intertidal and the coral reefs just offshore. For tens of millions of people, most of their protein comes from the sea and these coral reef systems. And for many of us, when we go to a restaurant and order seafood or fish or something, a lot of the stuff that we eat in Indiana or Massachusetts or Seattle, also the species there have part of their life cycle tied to coral reefs around the world. It may not be where they're harvested, but it may be where the eggs are deposited or the young develop later on, that those coral reefs are important nurseries for them. And then there's also at the bottom these ecosystem services. These are services that if we lost that thing, that ecosystem, say the coral reef, we'd have to spend a lot of money to create the structure that those reefs help protect things like they buffer waves from washing away the shore, causing erosion, property damage. The coral reefs offshore help protect those waves from damaging coastal wetlands, including where we live, the ports and harbors where we have a lot of our industry. And so these offshore reefs have a protective part as well that can be very important. So a lot of the questions you guys sent me involved what are some of the threats to coral reefs around the world. I'm going to focus on 2 of these, the top 2, coral bleaching and ocean acidification. These are 2 kind of emerging things that are really hot topics in coral reef ecology right now, including us at Earthwatch. We have projects coming online right now that are looking at remedying coral bleaching and also looking at ocean acidification. We have a project that we're starting up in Acadia National Park in Maine, having students like you guys involved in collecting data on how the intertidal zone and tide pools, how acidification is affecting the species that are there. But there's some other threats. When we have these big storms that come through, some of these big storms and the big waves end up causing some damage to the coral reefs. There's also pollution from land. A lot of it is solid, a lot of it is chemical stuff washing off the land in coastal areas that can influence coral reefs. Oil spills can cause a lot of damage, especially if it happens at the same time that the corals are releasing their eggs, because they all do that, usually one species in a region, they all do it at the exact same time. And that can, if there happens to be an oil spill or some other source of pollution during that time, it can wipe out that next generation there. And there's also even some kinds of fishing that can impact coral reefs. Nets being dragged behind ships sometimes get caught in the coral reefs and pull up, dislodge the coral. Most of the coral structure is calcium-based, and it can be very fragile and brittle, and so they're very vulnerable to some of the impacts from waves, from ships that might be drifting through or dragging an anchor in some areas where there might be some recreational divers. Some of your questions actually talk a little bit about chloral bleaching that you were, and some of you were even specifically asking questions about the zooxanthellae and why that ends up being lost. And the story with coral bleaching is one that as the water temperature warms just even a tiny bit, the water temperature can just go up a couple degrees, but over a long period of time is enough of a difference for these organisms that are used to it being a little bit cooler that they expel that algae relationship that causes, that helps them gain the food that they need to survive. But when they do that, they often become that bleachy white color that impacts their ability to grow and add new structure. And over time, if the water temperature stays warm for quite some time and that those algae don't culture back into the living coral, then that whole coral can die. White coral isn't necessarily dead, but it's impacted. It's not healthy. And I've had opportunities in a couple different places, including one of the places in the Rainforest and Reefs book. I was on this island called Ranguana Key in 1988, and the key was just very healthy. The coral heads right around, just snorkeling right off the beach, were very healthy and strong and vibrant colors. In 1994, really close to the island, some of the shoreline coral communities were starting to show some of the signs of coral bleaching. They were looking more white. Now, these photos are not from that specific spot. I just happened to find this online where they did a study in one spot that showed some of this bleaching taking place, where they had kind of a before and after picture. I don't have those pictures because I'm still moving stuff from Seattle to Boston, but as soon as those pictures catch up, I'll be able to tell this story a little bit better. I went back to that same island in 1998, and the water temperature in the Caribbean in 1998 was at almost an all-time record high. And it was like going in off the beach, it was almost like going into a really hot bathtub. That's how hot the water was. And when we got into the water, the coral all surrounding the island looked like the picture on the right. Almost all the coral had bleached out and was very light color. I've not been back since 1998. I'm not sure what's going on there, although I do see reference to Ranguana Key in terms of people doing research on coral bleaching. The other thing that I said that I'd talk about a little bit is ocean acidification. You're familiar a little bit about greenhouse gases increasing, specifically carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as that goes up into the atmosphere and that material accumulates in the atmosphere, some of it is actually absorbed by the ocean. If the ocean wasn't absorbing some of this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, there would be a lot more issues with related to climate change. But the ocean is absorbing a lot of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is a good thing for climate change, but it's a tough thing for ocean ecology, because what happens is that carbon dioxide, CO2, becomes carbonic acid when it mixes in the water. And that slight increase in acidity affects a lot of species that are built around calcium. So here's an experiment. Ms. Kapler, if you have a chance to come up with this research design, you could probably design it yourself. But you could figure out what the natural pH or the acidity level of, say, the Atlantic Ocean might be. And you can put like an Alka-Seltzer or a piece of chalk in there, and then add some vinegar until it reaches the degree of acidity that we're seeing in some of these coastal areas. And what you'll probably see is that piece of chalk start to bubble and fizz, because that acidity is eating in the carbon, or the calcium is being dissolved by that increased acidity. And for a lot of shellfish, clams, mussels, a lot of species in the Pacific Northwest, we're seeing it in some of the big oyster beds. The baby oysters that they try to inoculate these landscapes with to grow new oysters. These baby oysters have very, very thin calcium-based shells, and the acidity is up just a little bit, but it's enough that they can't form the shells right. And so at the bottom of this page, I'll send you a link to this, Ms. Kapler, so that you can look at this. It's a really nice story about a family that is growing oysters in Washington State, and how they can't do it in Washington State anymore. They can't raise the young in Washington State. They now have a property in Hawaii where they send these baby oysters to grow for the first couple years, and then they bring them back and put them back. But that first stage, when they're very young, they're vulnerable to the increased acidity of the nearshore habitat. So we talked about some kind of depressing stuff, and I usually don't like talking about that. What I've learned is that we can do a lot more, we can accomplish a lot more with just a little dash of hope for, and actually more than hope. I use this word because one of my favorite people in the world, Jane Goodall, has a book called Hope for the Animals in Their World. And it's a book that highlights a lot of the endangered species and people, like the people we partner with at Earthwatch, that are working really hard to bring back species from the brink of extinction. The co-author, you might recognize his name on there, Thane Maynard, wrote this book with Jane, one of the two co-authors on this book, and highlights a lot of the wonderful things that are going on around the world of people who are really working to help make a difference. Thane has another book that Jane wrote the foreword on, I just realized again. And for those of you that might be interested in working with wildlife as a career, he has a really good book called Working with Wildlife, A Guide to Careers in the Animal World. That's a good introduction to the diversity of people all over the world that are working to help save wildlife. There's some other books that can help you get outside, though. There's some wonderful resources. These are called field guides, and I've grown up using books like this. The top line shows some of the bird books, Field Guide to the Birds, that are available, so you can learn about what species of birds are found in your neck of the woods. But down at the bottom, you can have a field guide to rocks and minerals, if that's what you're interested in, edible plants, reptiles and amphibians, even stars and planets. There's guides to those. These are great resources to help connect you to the natural world and get out and develop an understanding of how nature works. Bottom line, that's my job. I'm a wildlife biologist, a conservation biologist. Sometimes I refer to myself as a terrestrial ecologist based on what I focus on. Ecology is the relationship between living things and other living things and living things in the non-living world. And basically, at the core of that is I try to figure out and learn how nature works. And a big part of that is learning about how nature works so that we can restore some of these areas. But I have 2 books that I want to recommend. Are you ready? You don't even need to write these names down. They're easy to remember. But if I could recommend just 2 books that you would carry with you for the rest of your lives, that would make your lives so full of wonder that you would never, ever, ever, ever be bored again, would you be interested in those books?
Yeah.
A passport is one. A passport is that little thing that says who you are, that gives you permission to go and travel countries all over the world. I didn't get my first passport until I was 24 years old. But since then, I've been filling my passport, not quite every year, but with a lot of travel, taking a lot of students to places around the world. Because being able to immerse yourself in another ecosystem that's different than the eastern deciduous forests around Plymouth or Boston or Seattle, being able to visit with cultures that have grown up in these areas, that have a very different way of living, is so rewarding, and it helps us figure out in so many ways who we are. The other book on that screen is a blank journal, like what Caitlin took into the rainforests of Belize, that she filled with her thoughts and her observations, documenting those things. You don't need the passport to be able to start seeing the natural world around you. My wife is wonderful at keeping track of when she sees the first salmonberry blooming at our home, or when the first warbler is seen in the trees behind our house. Keeping track of those things is a really good way that your observations can actually help inform scientists about what's going on in the world. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Both of these things that I'm talking about, we talked about extinction early on. A friend of mine, Robert Michael Pyle, in one of his books, he says, extinctions happen one backyard at a time. And that kind of struck home with me. I never really thought about that. But to me, that has made me think about my backyard at my house and trying to make sure that whatever animals and plants are native to where I live, I like to make sure that I'm providing habitat and home for those animals in the place where I live. And the other thing that Robert Michael Pyle said, and this is what I want to kind of wrap up with, is something that he's really concerned about is, as much as he's concerned about the extinction of species, he's also concerned about the extinction of experience, because we're losing those abandoned lots and those those wood lots at the end of the street that are these places that we can explore. I grew up in southwestern Ohio and had a wood lot that I could hike to from my house, up a creek, had to go underneath a bridge, and then I would get into this wild chunk of forest. It wasn't very big, but to me, when I was in second grade, that was like my Amazon rainforest. That was my African basin forest that allowed me great opportunities to explore. And I think we tend to lose a lot of these places like that, and so we don't spend as much time exploring the natural world in the areas where we live. I mentioned this group, and I tossed this up here because they provide opportunities for schools, especially school groups that are your age, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students. Global Explorers provides opportunities for to travel to these places that I've talked about. I was on the board of directors. I was one of the founding members of this organization. They're wonderful. They're doing some really cool stuff all over the world. They have trips to Costa Rica, trips to Peruvian Amazon, trips up to Churchill, Manitoba in the Arctic, trips to the desert Southwest, exploring those landscapes, trips to Tanzania in East Africa. They've taken students to Vietnam, Cambodia. Just a really cool organization. So if you're interested in learning more about the opportunities that are out there for travel, give these guys a peek. And then coming back around to where I work, Earthwatch Institute has been around since I wrote that essay in 1971. My interest in the natural world probably started before that, but the fact that I committed to that in 1971 means that Earthwatch and I are about the same age. And so I'm really excited to be joining these guys. I have been promoting the type of work that Earthwatch has been doing for 43 years. I've been promoting them for about 25 years, always trying to make the trips that I would lead more Earthwatch-esque, because this organization really invented citizen science, allowing everyday citizens to have an opportunity to work with scientists all over the world, help collect data that helps inform us with that big question of how nature works, or how did ancient cultures interact with the land. So there's a lot of really cool archaeological projects. Some of our projects are about ocean health and climate change and wildlife studies. So I know Ms. Kapler has information about Earthwatch and the types of programs that we do. We do also have projects where student groups starting in high school can also participate in these research teams, helping collect coral reef data. We have a new project starting out in the Cayman Islands. We have projects in the Bahamas, projects offshore Costa Rica. We've had projects all over the world looking at coral reef ecology, as well as a lot of rainforest ecology stuff. So if you're interested in learning more about these, there's great, the website has a lot of really good information on there. You're familiar with the 3 R's. You're in school, so you're familiar with reading, writing, and arithmetic. I'm going to add 3 more, and that includes restore, reconnect, and rewild. And so you guys are blessed to live where you live in northern Indiana. When I was at the Cincinnati Zoo, that same group of students that I would take to the Amazon or to East Africa or to Belize to do this Rainforests and Reefs book, I would take up to Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area the first weekend in November every year to see the sandhill cranes. And I hope some of you have had an opportunity to drive down the road and see those guys there. Right down, not too far south of there, is Battlegrounds Wolf Park. I'd stop by there every year on my way up to Jasper Pulaski, because there's a collection of wolves and a big herd of bison, and sometimes they put those two together to study how wolves interact with their prey. So a lot of what we know about wolf ecology comes from some of those studies of looking at how wolves interact with these animals. So you guys live in a great spot, and I encourage you to spend time outside exploring those areas. And I wanted to just end with, I think, some of the questions that I had on my list that you guys sent about what impacts the world. And we've talked a little bit about some of the impacts to coral reefs, some of the impacts to rainforests. Hopefully I've talked more about not so much the impacts, but how wonderful these landscapes are and these ecosystems are. But the greatest impact is the impact that you can make on the world. And so I hope, I had the word hope up on the screen, and hope is just the first level. I think it's more important to be hands-on, get your hands dirty, participate, go beyond hope and be part of that hope and change that you want to see in the world.
What happened?
I'm coming back. Sorry, I'll be back in a second. There we go. I'm back. Should be back now. Thank you for your attention. It was me talking a lot more, but I want to have an opportunity to answer some questions that you might have. So, I see a hand right there. Ms. Kapler, if you want to help facilitate some of the student questions.
Yep, I'll send a few up.
Okay. Give me a P! You have a P on there.
Oh, cute. So our group is doing our project on the rainforest of Madagascar, and you talked about logging in those rainforests and how it's affecting them. But I was wondering, how can we help stop the logging all the way across the world. Those rainforests.
It is so hard to do that. And some of the reasons for that logging are people, just like your families, trying to survive where you live in Plymouth, Indiana. There are families that are trying to survive in Madagascar and make a living. Madagascar has lost about 90% of its forests, its native forests, in this century. And what group of animals is having the hardest time with that loss of forest?
The lemurs.
The lemurs. In 2 weeks, I don't know if it's going to be in Indianapolis or Fort Wayne or Chicago, but in 2 weeks, actually on maybe more than 2 weeks, on April 4th, there's a new IMAX movie being released called Island of Lemurs, Madagascar, that features one of our Earthwatch scientists, Dr. Patricia Wright, who's kind of the Jane Goodall of lemurs. Anyway, she's featured, she's kind of the host of this film on lemurs that really tells the plight of what's going on in Madagascar. Your question about what we can do on this side is to try to figure out where some of the resources that we use, where those originate. And the internet allows us to trace some of these back, figure out what resources, where things are coming from. What do we get from Madagascar? We get some really cool stuff from Madagascar. We import more vanilla from Madagascar than I think anywhere else in the world. So a lot of our flavorings and vanilla grows best in a rainforest condition. So making sure that some of the things that we buy, there's some rainforest-friendly certification of some of these products, from chocolate to vanilla, coconut. There's even some oil palm, that tree that's causing a lot of problems in Borneo and Sumatra, is also being grown on Madagascar. And there's ways to grow it in harmony with the forest system rather than tearing out the forests. It's not an easy, I can't give you a definitive answer other than letting people know that you care about lemurs. And it's also important to let people know that you care about the people who live there as well. My wife, she works for an organization called the Snow Leopard Trust. She works not with snow leopards themselves, although she gets to travel to where they are and has helped put some satellite collars on them. But she works with the communities, the people who live in snow leopard habitat that might be having a hard time with a predator living so close to where they're raising their sheep and their goats. And so working with the local people is always a really important step, not by just pointing a finger and saying that what they're doing is wrong or bad and it's having a negative effect on snow leopards, but by working with them to come up with a solution on that. It's hard to do. It's one of the hardest things to do, but to really try to empower these communities because they don't want to lose the resources that help make their lives healthy and rich in so many ways as well. But sometimes they have no other choice when they're trying to feed their family. I'd recommend when that project comes, when the IMAX film comes out, it would be a really cool opportunity to go take a look and learn more about lemurs and what's going on in Madagascar. We're really excited to be working with Pat Wright, working on bringing her back on board for 2015. So by the time you guys are in high school, you might be able to go to Madagascar and help us study lemurs. We're doing a lemur population genetics project with Pat starting next year.
We have about maybe 5 more minutes for questions, and then that's probably going to be close to our time here. So.
Okay.
I just wondered how we could minimize the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere and into the ocean.
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people are asking that question right now, trying to come up with good solutions. I just drove all the way across the country at the end of January. I drove from Seattle to Boston. Actually, I drove through northern Indiana, probably just north. I was on I-90 almost all the way, so I was just north of Plymouth. but in Washington State, in Montana, in Wyoming, in Nebraska, in South Dakota, in Iowa, in, I would say, maybe 2 or 3 other states, for the first time since I've gone driving back and forth, unfortunately driving my car that's burning petroleum, but I've seen more wind farms growing, big giant windmills producing energy. In particular, driving through Iowa, it was quite windy as I was driving through Iowa. And so I saw hundreds of these giant windmills spinning very fast, but not super fast, but they were producing electricity. Now there's some impact. Some of my friends are studying what the impact of these big propellers spinning in these areas might be on songbirds or hawks migrating through or bats flying at night. There are ways to fix that so they're not as damaging to the local wildlife. But being able to produce energy by just using the wind. The Cincinnati Zoo, a couple years ago, I haven't worked there since 1998, but they decided to try something and they put in a solar, the largest photovoltaic, so converting the solar energy from light to electricity, solar panels that shade their parking lot. And so on a sunny day at the zoo, they're producing enough electricity to offset some of the costs from the coal-based power that they're burning at the zoo. The technology is getting better and better and more efficient to convert the solar energy or the wind energy, these very renewable resources. Even in some of the intertidal areas, you can, with the waves coming in, you can have a generator that moves up and down with the waves that creates electricity. So there's a lot of the very creative people that are looking at that very question and coming up with ways to be able to produce the energy that we need to survive, but to reduce the dependence on coal and oil, gas, to do that. A lot of cars now are alternative fuels or are electrical cars that are available, and there's some incentives to convert an old car to buying a new electrical car. The prices are coming down lower and lower on those, and there's some, for those that are interested in tax credits, you could get some tax breaks, I guess, by getting some of those cars. But there are projects, like on all of our Earthwatch trips, the travel that people fly to do, there are ways to offset the amount of carbon that plane is emitting in your name. So there are ways to buy into projects that are absorbing carbon. In fact, rainforest trees are really good at absorbing carbon out of the atmosphere. So reforestation is a really good way to offset the addition of carbon into the atmosphere. Planting trees that grow fast, and protecting old forests. Old forests absorb a lot of the carbon out of the atmosphere. And so by protecting these big old forests in the Pacific Northwest, northern Midwest has some big old forests, Southeast has a lot of old forests, Northeast, the boreal forests up across Canada and all over the world, these older forests with giant trees are absorbing more of that carbon out of the atmosphere. And so it's a really good opportunity to save good habitat and also save and be able to absorb some of that carbon out of the atmosphere.
Well, Dr. Rullman, we really appreciate your time. The students have something to say to you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. I know I didn't get through everybody's answers to their questions. I tried to lump some of them together, but thank you for sending that list of questions, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity to chat with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that was fun. You must be exhausted.